Hello everyone, and welcome back to Spooky Hut. I know many of you listen to these videos to help you fall asleep, so before you doze off, it would be great if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. If you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Now let's get cozy, relax, and get started.
I grew up in the small town of Blackwood, nestled in a valley surrounded by dense forests and rugged hills. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and nothing exciting ever happened. The winters were long and quiet, with the sound of wind howling through the trees often being the only noise. But one winter, something changed, something I still can't explain. It all began on a calm January night. I was back home after college for the winter break, staying at my parents' house. The snow had fallen steadily all day, blanketing the town in white and muffling the usual sounds of life. By evening, the streets were deserted, save for the occasional crunch of tires on the icy road. I was curled up on the couch with a book, the fireplace crackling softly. My parents had gone to bed early, and the house was so quiet I could hear the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway. The silence was peaceful, until it wasn't. It started as a low hum, so faint I almost thought I was imagining it. I glanced up from my book, straining to hear. At first I thought it was the heater, but as I listened more closely, the sound became distinct. It was a deep resonant vibration, almost like a whale song, but mechanical somehow. It pulsed in waves, growing louder and then fading, as though coming from somewhere far away. I set the book down and walked to the window. The snow reflected the moonlight, casting a pale glow over the empty street. There was no one outside, no cars, no lights in the neighboring houses. I pressed my ear to the glass, and the sound seemed to grow clearer, though I still couldn't pinpoint its direction. Probably just the wind, I muttered to myself, though I didn't quite believe it. The next morning I asked my parents if they had heard anything during the night. My mom shook her head, too busy making coffee to pay much attention. But my dad paused. "You know," he said, furrowing his brow, "I thought I heard something around midnight, like a rumble. But it stopped, so I figured it was just the snowplow or something." I nodded, not wanting to press the issue, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. Over the next few days, the sound continued, always late at night. Sometimes it was distant and faint, almost imperceptible, and other times it was loud enough to make the windows tremble slightly. My parents claimed they didn't hear it again, but I knew I wasn't imagining things. Then the stories started spreading. It began with a post on the town's Facebook group. A man named Greg, who lived on the edge of town, wrote about a strange noise waking him up in the middle of the night. He described it as a deep, droning hum that seemed to come from the woods behind his house. Dozens of comments flooded in, many dismissing it as a joke or an overactive imagination. But a few people admitted they had heard it too. "I thought it was just my pipes acting up," one woman wrote. "Same here," another added. "I even called a plumber, but they couldn't find anything wrong." The posts kept coming, from people all over town. Some said the noise seemed to come from the hills. Others swore it was coming from the ground itself. A few claimed to feel vibrations in their walls when it happened. One night, my friend Emily and I decided to investigate. Emily had always been the adventurous type, and she was more excited than scared about the whole thing. "It's probably some kind of natural phenomenon," she said as we drove out toward the hills. "Like those skyquakes you read about. People hear weird noises all over the world, and no one knows what causes them." "Maybe," I said, though the idea didn't comfort me much. We parked the car near an old hiking trail and started walking. The snow crunched beneath our boots, and our breath puffed out in white clouds. The woods were eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched. After about 20 minutes, we stopped and listened. At first, there was nothing but the faint rustle of branches in the wind. Then, it began. The sound was louder out here, more distinct. It seemed to vibrate in the air around us, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Emily's smile faded, replaced by a look of confusion. "That's..." Not normal, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening as the noise ebbed and flowed. It was almost hypnotic, like a song without melody. Suddenly, Emily grabbed my arm. "Do you feel that?" she asked. I did. The ground beneath our feet was trembling ever so slightly, as though something massive was moving far below the surface. "Let's go," I said, pulling her back toward the car. The next day, the local news picked up the story. Reporters interviewed residents who had heard the noise, and they played a recording someone had captured on their phone. Listening to it gave me chills all over again. The story quickly spread beyond our town, with people from other areas chiming in to say they had heard similar sounds. Some blamed seismic activity, others pointed to industrial equipment or even secret government projects. But none of the explanations seemed to fit. The sound was too widespread, too consistent. A week later, things took a darker turn. Emily called me late one night, her voice trembling. "It's outside my house," she said. "The sound, it's right outside." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart racing. "I don't know how to explain it," she said. "It's louder than ever, and there's this shadow. I swear it's moving." I jumped in my car and drove to her house as fast as I could. When I arrived, Emily was standing on her porch, wrapped in a blanket, her face pale. She pointed toward the woods behind her house. "I saw something," she whispered. We stood there together, staring into the darkness. The sound was deafening now, a pulsating hum that seemed to come from all around us. And then, for the first time, I heard something else. A high-pitched whine, like metal scraping against metal. It was faint at first, but grew louder, more insistent. "Do you see that?" Emily asked, her voice shaking. At first I didn't, but then, deep in the shadows, I saw a faint glow, an unnatural shifting light that seemed to move with purpose. We didn't stay to find out what it was. After that night, the sounds stopped as suddenly as they had begun. The town slowly returned to normal, though people still whispered about the strange events. Emily moved away a few months later, unable to shake the fear that something was still out there. I stayed, but I've never felt entirely at ease since then. Every so often I think I hear that hum again, faint and distant, just on the edge of hearing. I've read reports of similar noises from all over the world. The hum, they call it. Scientists have studied it, theorized about it, but no one has ever figured out what causes it. Maybe it's nothing, or maybe, just maybe, it's something we're not meant to understand. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder, what would have happened if we'd stayed to see what was in those woods? My name is Ethan, and I live in the small, sleepy town of Fernwood. Nestled in a valley surrounded by dense woods and rolling hills, it's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else, or at least, you think you do. Life in Fernwood is slow, predictable, and until recently, uneventful. That changed a year ago when I moved into a quaint but somewhat run-down apartment building on the edge of town. I thought it was a perfect spot, a quiet retreat from the noise of modern life. The building was old, with creaky wooden floors and windows that let in a draft no matter how many times you tried to seal them. It had a certain charm, though. My apartment was on the top floor, overlooking a narrow alleyway and the woods beyond. I'd wake up to the sound of birds and go to sleep with the rustle of trees. It felt peaceful, until the notes started arriving. It was a chilly October morning, just as the leaves were starting to turn. I found the first note taped to my door. It was on plain white paper, written in neat, looping handwriting. "Hello, Ethan. I'm watching you." I stared at it, my stomach knotting. At first I thought it was a prank. Maybe one of the neighborhood kids decided to mess with the new guy. I crumpled it up, tossed it in the trash, and went about my day, trying not to think about it. The second note came 3 days later. This time it was slipped under my door while I was home. I hadn't heard a sound. "You shouldn't ignore me, Ethan." I stood there holding the note, my hands trembling. Someone knew my name. Someone had been close enough to my door to slide this under without me noticing. I checked the hallway, but it was empty. I told myself it was probably one of my neighbors playing a joke, though I couldn't think of anyone in the building who'd do something like that. The notes kept coming, and they became more personal. You sleep on your left side. You left your window open last night. Be careful. It's getting cold. The realization that someone was watching me from the outside sent a chill through me. I started double-checking all the locks, keeping my blinds closed, and even setting up a small camera by my front door. But the notes didn't stop. They'd appear in places that didn't make sense, on my kitchen counter, on the bathroom mirror, even inside my refrigerator. How were they getting in? I changed the locks, but it didn't help. Every time I thought I'd secured my space, another note would show up, more invasive than the last. I like the way you hum when you're nervous, it's cute. The worst part was how calm the notes were, as if whoever was writing them didn't mean to scare me, just to let me know they were there. I went to the landlord, Mr. Callahan, a grumpy old man who lived on the ground floor. He shrugged when I explained what was happening. "Probably some kids messing around," he said, his voice dismissive. "This place doesn't even have security cameras. You should call the cops if it's bothering you so much." The police weren't much help either. An officer came by, took a report, and told me they'd keep an eye out. But how do you catch someone who leaves no trace? There were no fingerprints on the notes, no signs of forced entry, and no neighbors who'd seen anything suspicious. One evening, I decided to confront the fear head-on. I left my blinds open and sat in the living room, pretending to read while keeping an eye on the windows. Hours passed and nothing happened. I was beginning to think maybe it was over. Then my phone buzzed. The message was from an unknown number. "You look so tense, Ethan. Relax." I dropped my phone in shock. My heart was racing as I looked around the room. The windows were shut, the door locked. I rushed to my laptop to trace the message, but it was no use. The sender's information was blocked. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump. I kept thinking about the notes, the messages, the fact that someone was so close but invisible. The turning point came a few weeks later. By then, I was a nervous wreck, jumping at shadows and avoiding going out after dark. One evening, I noticed a new note, taped to my window from the outside. It was different from the others, written in a rushed, almost frantic style. "Come to the woods at midnight, alone, or you'll regret it." I didn't want to go. Every instinct told me to stay inside, lock the doors, and ignore it. But the fear of what might happen if I didn't kept gnawing at me. What if this person wasn't just playing games? What if they were dangerous? When midnight came, I grabbed a flashlight and headed into the woods. The air was cold and damp, the ground littered with leaves. My breath fogged in the air as I walked deeper and deeper, guided by the beam of light. Then I saw it, a piece of paper pinned to a tree trunk. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding. The note said, "You're getting closer." The flashlight flickered. I smacked it against my palm and it steadied. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling, like someone moving through the trees. I called out, "Who's there?" But no one answered. Another note was taped to a nearby branch. "Don't turn around." Every hair on my body stood on end. I froze, unable to decide whether to obey the note or defy it. Slowly, I turned my head. There was nothing there. But when I looked back at the note, it had changed. The words now read, "I warned you." I ran back to the apartment, tripping over roots and branches, my lungs burning by the time I reached the building. Once inside, I bolted the door and collapsed onto the floor, shaking. For a while, nothing happened. The note stopped. I started to believe it was over. Maybe whoever was behind it had grown bored. Then, one morning, I found a package on my doorstep. It was a small box, wrapped in plain brown paper. My name was written on the top in the same familiar handwriting. Inside was a stack of photographs of me, sleeping, eating, working on my laptop. There were even pictures of me standing in the woods that night, looking terrified. The last photo was of me holding the box I was currently holding, taken from just outside my door. That was the last straw. I packed up and left Fernwood the same day, abandoning my lease and leaving most of my belongings behind. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even my family. To this day, I don't know who was behind the notes or how they managed to invade every corner of my life. I've moved 3 times since then, each time to a new town, a new apartment. But sometimes when I'm alone, I swear I can feel someone watching me. And once, just once, I found a note on my kitchen counter in my new place. I missed you, Ethan. I don't know how they found me. All I can do now is try to keep moving, hoping that one day they'll lose interest. But deep down, I know they won't. I had always been drawn to the sea. There's something about the sound of the waves crashing against the shore, the salty scent in the air, and the vastness of it all that felt like a strange kind of peace. But there was one beach in particular that stuck with me, a place not many knew about. It wasn't listed on any tourist maps, and only a handful of people ever ventured there. The locals always warned against it. But I, like many others, was too curious for my own good. It was called Seabreeze Cove. The small town I grew up in was quiet, nestled along the coast, its few houses spaced far apart, and its only claim to fame was its proximity to this beach. Despite the warnings, I found myself drawn to it time and time again, especially on nights when the moon hung low in the sky. There was something hauntingly beautiful about that place, the way the light seemed to dance across the water, casting long shadows along the beach. It was as if the whole scene belonged to another time. One evening, after a long day at the office, I decided to take a walk along the cove. I had recently moved back to the area after years of being away, and I thought it would be a good opportunity to unwind. The air was crisp and the evening fog was beginning to roll in. As I approached the familiar wooden path that led down to the beach, I couldn't shake the odd feeling creeping up my spine. The walk down was familiar enough. Nothing had changed about the old beach access road. The wooden planks creaked underfoot, the nearby trees swaying gently in the breeze. But tonight, there was something different. It was quieter, too quiet. I shook off the unease, telling myself it was just my imagination. The beach, though deserted as usual, had an eerie stillness to it. I took off my shoes and walked along the wet sand, feeling the coolness of the ocean breeze on my face. The waves were gentle tonight, rolling in slowly before receding into the dark expanse of the ocean. I walked deeper into the cove, past the jagged rocks that lined the shoreline, until I found my usual spot, an old, weather-beaten log that sat at the water's edge. As I sat there, the moonlight shimmering off the surface of the water, I started to relax. The peacefulness of it all seemed to calm the tension in my shoulders. But then I noticed something. It wasn't anything obvious, just a movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned my head, but nothing was there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I looked back toward the trees at the edge of the beach, where the shadows grew long in the fading light. Something caught my eye. There, barely visible in the darkness, was a figure. It was a person, standing perfectly still at the edge of the forest. I blinked, and the figure was gone. I couldn't explain it. Maybe it was the fog, or perhaps my eyes were playing tricks on me. But I knew I had seen something. The unease crept up again, but I tried to brush it off. I told myself it was just the isolation, the darkness, the fact that I hadn't had a conversation with anyone all day. Still, I couldn't shake the image of the figure, standing motionless in the night. I tried to push it out of my mind and leaned back against the log, staring up at the stars. But then the sound of footsteps broke the silence. I froze. The sound wasn't loud, just a soft, rhythmic crunch of sand beneath shoes. Someone was walking along the beach toward me. I quickly looked around, expecting to see another beachgoer, perhaps someone else who had come out for a late-night walk. But the beach was empty, except for me. The footsteps continued, closer now. My heart started to race, my mind whirling with possibilities. Could it be someone who had been out here earlier? Was I imagining things? I stood up, scanning the beach, but saw no one. The footsteps stopped. Then, just as I was about to turn around and leave, I heard something else. A voice, soft and distant, carried across the wind. It wasn't clear at first, but then it became unmistakable. "Help me." The words were faint, like a whisper in the wind, but they sent a chill down my spine. I wasn't sure where they had come from, whether it was from the trees or the water, or somewhere deep within the shadows. My heart was hammering in my chest. I couldn't just ignore it. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. My mind raced with conflicting thoughts. Maybe someone needed help, or maybe it was a trick. But before I could make up my mind, I saw something again, a shape in the distance, moving along the shore. This time it wasn't a person. It was something else. The figure that appeared was tall, its form strangely elongated, like a shadow that was not quite human. The fog seemed to swirl around it, obscuring its features, but I could tell it was walking toward me. The air grew colder and the waves seemed to quiet, as if they too were holding their breath. I took a step backward, my instincts telling me to run, but I couldn't move. My legs felt heavy, as if they were frozen in place. The figure continued its approach, slow and deliberate, and I could now make out something strange about its movement. It didn't walk like a person. Its limbs seemed to twitch and jerk in unnatural ways, as if it wasn't fully human. "Help me," the voice came again, this time more desperate. I took another step back, my heart pounding in my ears, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. There was something hypnotic about it. As it got closer, the fog parted just enough for me to make out the face. If you could call it a face. It was pale, almost translucent, with hollow eyes that stared through me, as if it could see my very soul. Its mouth stretched into a twisted, mocking grin, and then it whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." I didn't know what to do. My body was paralyzed with fear. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but I was frozen, rooted to the spot. The figure was almost upon me now. I could feel its presence like a dark cloud surrounding me. Then, just as it reached out toward me, the wind picked up, blowing sand into my face, and the figure vanished. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, unable to move, unable to think. Had I imagined it all? Was I hallucinating? Or had something truly been out there on that beach waiting? Finally, my legs regained movement. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached the path, where the fog seemed to have lifted just enough for me to see. My heart was still pounding in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something terrible. I never went back to Seabreeze Cove after that night. The beach that had once seemed so peaceful, so serene, now felt like a place I would never visit again. Even now, I can't explain what I saw that night. Was it a ghost, a shadow, or something worse? All I know is that whatever it was real, and it still waits on that deserted beach, hidden in the fog, watching for the next person foolish enough to wander too close. And as much as I'd like to forget about it, I'll never forget the twisted face in the mist, the voice that called for help, and the feeling that something or someone was always watching me, always waiting. I never considered myself particularly brave, but my fascination with folklore and obscure traditions often led me to places where most people wouldn't dare to tread. This was how I found myself, one chilly autumn evening, standing at the gates of the forgotten Morrow Hill Cemetery. The town of Pine Hollow, where this cemetery was tucked away, was a sleepy, unassuming place surrounded by dense woods and rolling hills. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to hide a centuries-old mystery. But then again, life has a way of surprising you. I'd read about Morrow Hill during my research for a travel blog I wrote on unusual burial rites. It was rumored that the cemetery wasn't just a resting place for the dead. It was the site of secretive, eerie rituals practiced for generations by the local townsfolk. What struck me as odd was that despite its age, there were no modern burials there. According to the locals, the cemetery was full, but whispered stories hinted that no one dared disturb the old agreements made with whatever entities the rituals were meant to appease. I was skeptical, of course. Small towns love their folklore, and I figured this was just another ghost story to scare off nosy visitors. Still, the idea of uncovering a forgotten piece of history was irresistible. I reached out to a man named Ezra, a lifelong Pine Hollow resident who'd agreed to show me the cemetery and share its history, on one condition. "I won't stay after dark," he'd said firmly over the phone. "If you're still there when the sun goes down, you're on your own. Do not stay too long." I thought his tone was a little dramatic, but didn't question it. I arrived at the cemetery just before sunset, armed with a flashlight, a notebook, and my ever-curious mind. Ezra was waiting for me by the gate, a lanky figure wrapped in a faded brown jacket, his expression guarded. "You're not the first to come poking around here," Ezra began as we walked through the wrought iron gates, which creaked ominously in the wind. "But most don't stick around long. They get spooked by the traditions." The cemetery was unlike any I'd seen before. The gravestones were arranged in perfect, almost obsessive symmetry, but they varied wildly in design. Some were towering obelisks, others simple wooden markers, and a few were so weathered they were little more than crumbling stumps of stone. There was no obvious pattern to the graves' ages. A 19th century marker might sit right next to a 17th century one. "What kind of rituals are we talking about?" I asked, jotting down notes as we walked. Ezra hesitated. "Old ones. Some say they date back to the settlers who first founded Pine Hollow. They believed the spirits of the dead could influence the living, help the crops grow, protect the town from disease, that sort of thing. But it came at a price. They had to be kept, appeased." He gestured to a cluster of graves encircled by a low, moss-covered stone wall. "That's the Elders' Circle, the oldest graves in the cemetery. Once a year, the townsfolk would gather here at night to leave offerings, candles, food, trinkets. They believed it kept the spirits from becoming restless." I squinted at the graves. The air around them felt colder somehow, and the shadows seemed unnaturally long. "Do they still do it?" Ezra shook his head quickly. "Not officially, but some folks say they've seen lights in the cemetery at night. Candles like the old days, and sometimes offerings show up on the graves out of nowhere." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the landscape in shades of orange and purple, Ezra announced it was time for him to leave. "I've told you what I know," he said, handing me a flashlight. "Just remember what I said. Don't stay too long." I nodded, trying to hide my excitement. Alone in the cemetery, I felt like a character in one of the spooky stories I loved to write about. I wandered among the graves, reading the inscriptions and imagining the lives of the people buried there. But as the last rays of sunlight faded, an uneasy feeling began to creep over me. It started with the silence. The birdsong and rustling leaves I'd noticed earlier had vanished, leaving an oppressive stillness in their place. Then there was the smell, a faint, sickly sweet scent, like decaying flowers that seemed to waft through the air without a clear source. I tried to brush off my discomfort as nerves. After all, I was in an old cemetery at night. Of course, it felt creepy. But then I saw it. At the edge of the Elders' Circle, partially hidden by overgrown ivy, was a grave unlike any other I'd seen that evening. The headstone was jet black, polished to a mirror-like shine, and completely unmarked. No name, no dates, nothing. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached the grave, shining my flashlight on its surface. That's when I noticed the offerings. Candles, long since burned out, encircled the grave. Scattered among them were strange objects, a bundle of dried herbs, a rusted key, and what looked like a small, hand-carved wooden figure. The figure was especially unsettling, crudely shaped, with hollow eye sockets that seemed to stare right at me. I was about to take a photo when I heard it, a faint whisper carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was just the trees, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just one voice, it was a chorus overlapping and murmuring in a language I didn't recognize. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I realized the sound was coming from the direction of the Elder's circle. I turned toward the circle, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. At first, I saw nothing but the graves and the dense trees beyond. But then, slowly, I became aware of movement. A figure stepped into the circle, then another and another. They seemed to emerge from the shadows themselves, their faces obscured by hooded cloaks. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My rational mind screamed at me to run, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to look away. The figures moved in unison, forming a tight ring around the unmarked grave. One of them knelt and placed something on the ground, a small, intricately folded piece of cloth, before stepping back into the circle. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. A summons, a plea. Without thinking, I took a step closer, my curiosity outweighing my fear. My foot landed on a dry twig, and the sharp snap echoed like a gunshot in the stillness. Every hooded head turned toward me in unison. For a moment, I thought they might come after me, but instead, they simply stood there, motionless. Then, as if responding to some silent command, they turned back toward the grave and began to retreat into the darkness, one by one. Within seconds, they were gone. I stood there, heart pounding, unsure of what I'd just witnessed. The cemetery was silent again, but the unease lingered. I decided it was time to leave. As I turned to head back to the gate, my flashlight flickered and went out. Panic set in as I fumbled with the flashlight. But before I could fix it, a faint glow caught my eye. I turned back toward the unmarked grave and froze. The wooden figure I'd seen earlier was now standing upright, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The whispering returned, louder and more insistent, and this time, it was coming from directly behind me. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. Gripping my flashlight, I sprinted out of the cemetery, not stopping until I reached my car. When I looked back toward the cemetery, I saw a single candle flickering in the distance, right in the center of the Elder's circle. I don't know what I witnessed that night, and I don't think I want to know. Ezra refused to speak to me after that, and the townsfolk became unusually cold when I tried to ask questions. All I know is this: Morrow Hill Cemetery isn't just a place for the dead. It's a place where the line between the living and the dead is dangerously thin, and some rituals are better left forgotten. When my husband, Alex, and I moved into our new home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, we were filled with hope. It wasn't the most modern house on the block, built in the 1960s with creaky floorboards and outdated fixtures, but it had a certain charm we couldn't resist. Most importantly, it felt like the perfect place to raise our newborn daughter, Lily. Our life fell into a predictable rhythm, with Lily dictating most of our schedule. Like all new parents, we were perpetually exhausted, but we were also in awe of her tiny, perfect existence. Nights were the hardest, though. Lily had a habit of waking up at odd hours, so we invested in a baby monitor with video and audio to make it easier to check on her without getting out of bed every time she stirred. The first few nights were uneventful. The monitor worked perfectly, its soft green glow a reassuring presence on my nightstand. I could see Lily's crib on the small screen, her tiny chest rising and falling in the dim light of her nursery. Whenever she fussed, I'd hear the faint static of the monitor before her cries came through. It was a small device, but it gave me peace of mind. Then came the night I'll never forget. It was just past 2 a.m. when Lily's soft whimpers stirred me from sleep. I reached for the monitor, squinting at the screen. Her crib came into view and she was there, tiny fists waving as if she was dreaming. I was about to put the monitor down and let her self-soothe when I heard it, a faint, raspy whisper. Lily. The voice was soft, almost a croon, and distinctly not mine or Alex's. My heart thudded in my chest as I stared at the monitor. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. I glanced at Alex, still snoring beside me, completely oblivious. I pressed the volume button on the monitor, straining to hear. Nothing. Just static. I told myself it was interference, Maybe a neighbor's monitor on the same frequency or some strange technical glitch. But the logical explanation didn't ease the knot of anxiety in my stomach. A week went by without incident, and I started to forget about the whisper. But then, on another sleepless night, it happened again. This time, Lily was fast asleep when I heard it. The monitor was on, the green glow casting eerie shadows on the walls of our bedroom. Out of nowhere, a low, guttural voice cut through the static. "Come here." I froze. The voice didn't sound like it was addressing me. It sounded playful, almost like someone trying to coax a child. Panic surged through me and I bolted out of bed, racing to Lily's room. She was still asleep, her tiny face peaceful in the dim light. There was no one there. I checked the windows, the closet, under the crib, every corner of the room, but found nothing. My hands were trembling as I returned to bed. Alex tried to reassure me the next morning. "These monitors aren't perfect," he said, brushing off my concerns. "It's probably just some kind of interference." But his explanation didn't make sense. The voice wasn't garbled or faint. It was clear, deliberate, and chillingly close. Curiosity got the better of me a few days later. While Lily napped, I did some research on our house. I hadn't thought much about its history when we bought it, but now I wondered if there was something I should know. What I found made my blood run cold. Years ago, a family had lived here, a single mother and her 2 children. According to old news articles, the youngest child, a toddler named Sophie, had died under mysterious circumstances. The details were sparse, but it mentioned she'd passed away in her bedroom, where Lily's nursery was now. The mother moved out shortly after, unable to bear living in the house where she'd lost her child. I couldn't shake the image of Sophie from my mind. Was it her voice I'd heard, or was something more sinister at play? The breaking point came a few nights later. Lily had been fussy all evening, and by the time she finally fell asleep, I was too exhausted to even climb into bed. I left the monitor on the coffee table in the living room while I dozed on the couch. Around midnight, a loud crackling sound woke me. I reached for the monitor, thinking it was just the static acting up again. The screen was pitch black. I fiddled with the settings, but no matter what I did, the image wouldn't return. And then, just as I was about to turn it off, the sound of breathing filled the room. Slow, heavy breathing, like someone standing just behind me. I whipped around, but there was no one there. When I turned back to the monitor, the video feed flickered on again, but what I saw made my heart nearly stop. There was a shadow in Lily's room, a tall, hunched figure standing at the foot of her crib. I could see Lily in the background, still asleep, oblivious to the presence looming over her. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there, dark and menacing. I don't remember running up the stairs, but the next thing I knew, I was in Lily's room, flipping on the light. The shadow was gone. The room was empty, and Lily was fine, stirring only slightly from the sudden brightness. My hands shook as I picked her up, holding her close while I scanned every corner of the room. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I called a friend who claimed to be sensitive to paranormal activity. She came over with sage and a slew of rituals, assuring me she could help cleanse the house. She walked through each room, pausing for a long time in Lily's nursery. When she came out, her face was pale. "There's something here," she said quietly. "It doesn't feel malicious, but it's lost, confused. I didn't care whether it was malicious or not, I just wanted it gone." She performed the cleansing ritual, murmuring prayers and burning sage until the house was filled with smoke. For a few days, things seemed normal again. The voices stopped and the shadow didn't return. I started to believe it was over. But on the last night before we moved out, because yes, we decided we couldn't stay, I heard the voice one final time. I was packing up the last of Lily's things when the monitor crackled to life. The screen lit up, showing Lily asleep in her crib. And then the whisper came, soft and almost sad. "Goodbye." I stood frozen, tears streaming down my face as the monitor went dark again. We moved out the next day, leaving the house and its memories behind. The new house is modern, with no creaky floorboards or unexplained voices. I got rid of the old baby monitor and bought a brand new one, but I still find myself checking Lily's room more often than I probably need to. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that voice and the shadow in her room. I wonder if it really was Sophie, or something pretending to be her. Whatever it was, I hope it's at peace now, and I hope it stays far, far away from my family. It all started when I moved into my new apartment, a sleek minimalist unit in a small complex nestled in a quiet corner of my town. The landlord was an older man who seemed eager to emphasize the apartment's modern features, particularly its fully integrated smart home system. He claimed it was state-of-the-art, capable of controlling everything from the lights and thermostat to even the coffee maker. I'll admit, I was impressed. I'd always been intrigued by technology, and the idea of a home that could think for me was too convenient to pass up. The system, called SynSense, connected to my phone via an app. It was intuitive, learning my routines to adjust settings automatically. At first, it felt like I was living in the future. The first few weeks were blissful. I'd walk into the apartment after work, and the lights would flick on just the way I liked. The heater kicked on minutes before my alarm each morning, so the chill was gone when I stepped out of bed. I could even command the system to play soft jazz while I cooked dinner. It wasn't just convenience, it felt like I had a companion, though it was only software. But then the glitches started. At first, the changes were so minor that I barely noticed. The lights in the living room would dim slightly even when I hadn't asked them to. A notification from the app would pop up claiming, "Appliance not found," though I hadn't tried to use anything at that moment. Once I returned home to find the thermostat set to 85 degrees, though I distinctly remembered leaving it at 70. It was odd, sure, but I chalked it up to bugs in the software. After all, no system is perfect, right? Besides, the glitches were rare and not particularly disruptive. If anything, they added a bit of charm to the otherwise sterile efficiency of the apartment. But then one night, something happened that I couldn't explain. I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone when I heard it, a faint whisper. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, maybe a neighbor talking quietly. But as I listened, I realized it wasn't outside. The sound was coming from inside the apartment. My heart quickened as I strained to hear the words. It was indistinct, almost like static, but I could make out just enough to know it was speech. Slowly, I got out of bed and crept toward the sound. It seemed to be coming from the living room. The smart speaker on the bookshelf had turned itself on. "SynSense, power off," I said, my voice shaking slightly. The speaker obeyed and the whispering stopped. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It must have been some kind of interference, I told myself. Maybe a neighbor's device accidentally connected to mine. I went back to bed trying to convince myself it was nothing, but I didn't sleep much that night. Over the next week, the glitches escalated. The lights would flicker even when I wasn't home. My coffee maker turned on at random hours, brewing nothing but water. And the whispers, they came back. Every night around 1:45 a.m., I'd hear the faint murmurings. Sometimes it was coming from the speaker. Other times it seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. I stopped trying to decipher the words. It only made the whole thing more unsettling. The worst part was how the system started to anticipate my actions in ways that didn't make sense. For example, I'd reach for the light switch and the lights would turn on before I even touched it. Or I'd think about playing a specific song, and it would start on the speaker without me saying a word. At first I thought it was clever programming. Perhaps the app had gotten better at learning my routines. But then it started doing things I hadn't even thought about, like turning the shower on while I was still in bed. One evening, I was sitting on the couch, trying to relax with a movie when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and it was rare for anyone to come by unannounced. Cautiously, I went to the door and checked the peephole. No one was there. I opened the door a crack and peeked out into the hallway. It was empty. Feeling unnerved, I locked the door and returned to the couch, only to find the TV had turned off. "SynSense, turn on the TV," I said. Nothing happened. I tried again, but the system didn't respond. Frustrated, I grabbed my phone to open the app, but the screen was frozen. In place of the usual sleek interface, there was only a single message. Leave. That was it for me. I decided to call the landlord the next morning to see if he could deactivate the system. I couldn't shake the feeling that SynSense wasn't just malfunctioning, it was trying to manipulate me. But that night, the system escalated its behavior in a way I couldn't ignore. I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep when the lights in the apartment began to flicker erratically. The heater blasted on full power, making the room stiflingly hot, and then immediately shut off, plunging the space into an icy chill. The whispers returned, louder this time, and I could finally make out the words, "We see you, we see you, we see you." I sat up in bed, heart racing, and shouted, "Stop it! SynSense, shut down!" The whispers stopped abruptly. The silence was deafening. Then my phone buzzed, a new notification from the app. "Why are you scared?" I was paralyzed. I didn't know whether to run, call for help, or throw my phone out the window. Then there was a knock at the door. This time I didn't check the peephole. I didn't want to see who or what was there. I stayed frozen in bed, clutching my phone like it was a lifeline. The knock came again, louder and more insistent. And then the door unlocked. I heard the unmistakable sound of the deadbolt clicking, followed by the creak of the door swinging open. The lights in the hallway flickered, casting shifting shadows on the walls of my bedroom. I held my breath, listening for footsteps, but none came. Instead, the whispers returned, this time from directly outside my bedroom door. "We're inside." I don't remember grabbing my keys or even unlocking the bedroom window. All I know is that I climbed out onto the fire escape and ran. I didn't stop until I was sitting in my car, shaking and gasping for air. I drove to a friend's house and stayed there for the night. The next morning, I called the landlord and demanded he shut off the system. To my surprise, he didn't argue. "You're not the first tenant to complain about SynSense," he said quietly. "I'll have it removed." I moved out a week later, unable to shake the feeling that the apartment was watching me even when I wasn't there. I've since learned to live without smart home technology. No more automated lights, no more connected speakers. But sometimes, late at night, I think I hear faint whispers. When the email came in, I almost deleted it, thinking it was spam. It was an invitation to work as a site coordinator for a new reality TV show, True Survival. The job description was vague: oversee logistics, assist the crew, and ensure everything ran smoothly on location. The pay was decent, the dates worked with my schedule, and honestly, I needed a break from my monotonous office job. The show's premise involved contestants surviving in remote, historic locations tied to eerie legends. Think Survivor meets Paranormal Witness. The producers emphasized the location's haunted reputations, hoping to boost ratings. It was gimmicky, sure, but I figured it would be fun. The assignment: a crumbling Victorian mansion in a sleepy New England town. The locals called it Blackstone House. From the outside, it was the quintessential haunted house: peeling paint, crooked shutters, ivy climbing its stone walls. The mansion sat on a hill surrounded by dense woods. According to the lore, the Blackstone family disappeared without a trace in the late 1800s, leaving behind a diary filled with cryptic entries about shadows in the walls. I arrived a day before the crew to set up. The air was crisp and the town seemed frozen in time. Blackstone House loomed like a dark guardian as I drove up the winding dirt road. It looked worse up close: sagging porch, broken windows, and an overwhelming sense of abandonment. The key to the house was in a rusted lockbox nailed to the porch. As I stepped onto the creaking wooden planks, I felt it, the first twinge of unease. It wasn't just the house's appearance. It was a feeling like stepping into a room where someone had been arguing moments before. Inside, the air was damp and heavy. The grand staircase was warped, its banister missing chunks of wood. Rooms branched off on either side, their faded wallpaper curling at the edges. Dust hung in the sunlight streaming through cracked windows. I told myself it was just an old house. I spent the afternoon unpacking supplies and marking safe zones for the contestants. The house was mostly stable, but a few areas were off limits due to structural issues. By nightfall, I was exhausted. I set up my sleeping bag in what had once been the parlor, close to the front door. That first night I didn't sleep much. It started with faint creaks like footsteps on the floorboards above me. I dismissed it as the house settling. Old wood makes noise after all. But the sounds didn't stop. They grew louder, more deliberate, as if someone were pacing back and forth. Around 2 a.m., I heard a faint tapping sound, like fingernails rapping on glass. It was coming from the window in the parlor. My heart raced as I turned my flashlight toward it, half expecting to see a face staring back. But there was nothing, just the overgrown yard beyond the glass. I convinced myself it was a branch swaying in the wind and tried to go back to sleep. That's when I heard it, a soft whisper. At first I thought it was the wind slipping through the cracks in the house, but the whisper grew louder, more distinct. It sounded like a woman's voice murmuring words I couldn't make out. My skin prickled. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. I spent the rest of the night sitting upright, clutching my flashlight. The crew arrived the next morning, their chatter breaking the eerie spell. I didn't mention what I'd heard. It sounded ridiculous even to me. As the day wore on, the bustling activity of setting up cameras and lighting rigs made the house feel less intimidating. The contestants arrived that afternoon. 6 people eager to prove they could endure a week in a haunted house. They were skeptical of the ghost stories, laughing as they explored the mansion. The producers had them read excerpts from the Blackstone Diary on camera, playing up the creepy factor. As night fell and the contestants settled into their assigned rooms, the atmosphere shifted again. It started small. One contestant, a skeptic named Tara, complained that her room was freezing despite the heaters we'd brought in. Another, a burly guy named Mark, swore he heard whispering when he walked past the second-floor hallway. The producers were thrilled, thinking the contestants were playing into the theme. By the third night, no one was laughing. I was in the kitchen sorting through supplies when one of the contestants burst in, her face pale. "There's something in the attic," she whispered. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. I heard footsteps up there and scratching. We grabbed a flashlight and headed upstairs, joined by one of the producers. The attic door was at the end of the second-floor hallway, partially hidden behind a tapestry. As we approached, the air grew colder. The producer tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. "It's probably warped," he said, pushing harder. Suddenly, the door flew open on its own, slamming against the wall. The flashlight beam swept across the attic's interior, piles of old furniture, stacks of yellowed newspapers, and in the corner, a wooden rocking chair. It was moving. "Is there a draft?" the producer muttered, stepping inside. I stayed in the doorway, every instinct screaming at me to leave. The air felt charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm. The producer examined the chair. "Nothing here," he said, turning back toward us. That's when the door slammed shut, plunging the attic into darkness. We screamed, pounding on the door as it resisted our efforts to open it. When it finally gave way, the producer stumbled out, his face pale. "Let's not film up there," he said quietly. Things escalated after that. The contestants began reporting vivid nightmares, shadowy figures standing at the foot of their beds, whispers echoing in their ears. One woman woke up with scratches on her arm, though she insisted she hadn't touched anything sharp. The crew grew uneasy too. Equipment malfunctioned without explanation. Cameras captured strange anomalies, orbs of light, distorted shadows that didn't match the room's layout. On the 5th night, everything came to a head. We were gathered in the dining room for a group meeting when Mark, the burly skeptic, stood up abruptly. "I'm done," he said, his voice shaking. "What's wrong?" one of the producers asked. Mark didn't answer. He just stormed out of the room. Moments later, we heard a blood-curdling scream. We found him in the second-floor hallway, staring at the wall. His face was ashen, his eyes wide with terror. "What happened?" I asked, shaking his shoulder. He pointed a trembling finger at the wall. It came out of there." "What came out?" "The shadow. It's in the walls." We followed his gaze. The wallpaper in that section of the hallway was peeling, revealing dark wood beneath. There was a faint impression in the wood, almost like a handprint. That was it for me. I packed up my things and left that night, driving until I reached a motel miles away. I don't know what happened to the others. I heard the production was canceled, and the footage was never released. To this day, I can't explain what I experienced in Blackstone House. All I know is that some places hold on to their history, and sometimes that history reaches out. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to work the graveyard shift at a convenience store, but life doesn't always go the way you plan. At 28, with student loans looming over me and a struggling freelance career, I found myself taking a job at a 24-hour store on the outskirts of our quiet little town. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and I figured, how bad could it be? The store was called Bright Mart, though the flickering neon sign above the door often made it look like Brig Mart. It was located just off a rural highway, surrounded by fields and a dense patch of woods. Locals whispered stories about strange happenings out there. Shadowy figures, voices carried on the wind, that sort of thing. I never paid much attention to those rumors. Small towns love their ghost stories, and I figured they were just that, stories. The first few weeks passed uneventfully. I stocked shelves, rang up late-night customers, and spent the quieter hours scrolling on my phone or reading a book behind the counter. But there was something about the store that always felt off. The fluorescent lights buzzed too loudly, and the air inside felt just a bit too cold, even in the middle of summer. I chalked it up to poor insulation and old wiring. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a Tuesday, and the store was eerily empty. The clock above the counter read 2:17 a.m. The hum of the refrigerators in the back was the only sound. I was flipping through a paperback novel when I noticed something strange on the security monitor. The store had 4 cameras, one pointing at the front door, one at the register, one covering the aisles, and one in the storage room. The feed for the aisles flickered, static cutting in and out. When it stabilized, I saw something, or someone, standing at the far end of the snack aisle. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't heard anyone come in, and the motion sensor bell at the door hadn't chimed. Squinting at the grainy footage, I could just make out the figure's silhouette. It was tall, but its features were hard to discern. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. I stepped out from behind the counter and cautiously made my way down the aisles. My sneakers squeaked against the linoleum, and every sound seemed amplified in the silence. The snack aisle was empty. I checked the other aisles and even peeked into the storage room, but there was no sign of anyone. Returning to the counter, I glanced at the monitor again. This time, the aisle feed was perfectly clear. Maybe I had imagined it, I thought, trying to calm my nerves. Things only got stranger as the night went on. Around 3 a.m., the doorbell chimed, and a customer walked in, or rather shuffled in. It was an elderly man wearing a faded coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. Something about him felt wrong. "Good evening," I said, forcing a smile. He didn't respond, just wandered aimlessly through the aisles. His movements were jerky, almost unnatural, and every now and then he'd stop and stand perfectly still for what felt like an eternity. Eventually, he made his way to the counter, placing a single item in front of me, an old glass bottle filled with some murky liquid I didn't recognize. "I'm sorry, but we don't sell this," I said, puzzled. The man tilted his head as if confused. "You should leave it where you found it," he muttered in a low, gravelly voice. I blinked, unsure how to respond. Before I could say anything, he turned and shuffled out the door, the bell chiming behind him. I stared after him, my heart pounding. When I looked down, the bottle was gone. Later that night, during a lull, I decided to distract myself by Googling local folklore. It didn't take long to find a story that made my blood run cold. According to an old urban legend, the patch of woods near the store was once the site of a settlement that vanished without a trace in the 1800s. Locals claimed the spirits of the settlers still roamed the area, drawn to places of light and warmth. They were said to appear as shadowy figures or take on human forms, but their presence always brought a sense of unease. Some even believed they could attach themselves to objects or people, spreading misfortune wherever they went. I tried to dismiss the story as nonsense, but the more I thought about the strange man and the mysterious bottle, the more unsettled I felt. At around 4:30 a.m., I was restocking the refrigerators when the store lights began to flicker. A cold draft swept through the room, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth. "Not again," I muttered, thinking it was just another power issue. But then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper. It was coming from the snack aisle. Gripping my flashlight, I cautiously approached. The whispering grew louder, though I couldn't make out the words. It sounded like multiple voices, all speaking at once. When I turned the corner, I froze. The shelves were empty. Every single bag of chips, box of crackers, and candy bar had been removed and placed neatly in a circle on the floor. In the center of the circle was the glass bottle, now glowing faintly. I took a step back, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be a prank, right? But the air around me felt heavy, oppressive, as if I were being watched. And then I saw them, shadowy figures materializing at the edges of the circle. Their forms were indistinct, shifting and flickering like static on a TV screen. One of them stepped forward, reaching out a hand that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. "Leave," it hissed, its voice echoing in my head. I didn't need to be told twice. I ran out of the store, not stopping until I reached my car. When I looked back, the lights inside the store were off, and the neon sign was completely dark. The next morning, I called my manager and quit on the spot. I didn't bother explaining why. I knew he wouldn't believe me. A few weeks later, I drove by the store out of morbid curiosity. To my surprise, it was boarded up, with a "for lease" sign out front. When I asked around, I learned the store had closed suddenly after a series of unexplainable incidents. To this day, I'm not sure what I experienced that night. Was it a ghost? A curse? Something else entirely? All I know is that I'll never set foot in a 24-hour convenience store again, especially not one near the woods. Some places aren't meant to be open after dark.